Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. You know how we do it here? We take some really interesting material and really try to dig in.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about today's because we're going to be looking at this excerpt called How to Hear God's Voice Clearly.
Okay.
And it's interesting because it starts right out of the gate by quoting John 10.27. And so I'm really curious to see where they're going to take this because I think the concept of hearing God's voice is something that a lot of people are interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Right off the bat, how to hear God's voice clearly. It kind of implies that you can,
Yeah.
like there's a way to do this.
Right, like a method.
Yeah, and that this is something that you can learn.
Right.
And I think that that's really interesting for people because, it's almost like a superpower.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I think is always the question in my mind is like, okay, so what does that even mean, though?
Right.
To hear God's voice? Because is it like a literal voice?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or is it like a feeling? Or is it, what are we even talking about here?
Well, and that's where that verse comes in. I think John 10.27.
Okay.
And in that passage, Jesus is comparing himself to a shepherd.
Okay.
And he says, "My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me."
Okay.
And I think what's interesting about that is he's saying, like, my sheep know my voice.
Right.
And I think there is a way in which we can sort of train ourselves to recognize what that is.
Yeah. Like a sense of knowing.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah, like an intuition.
Yeah.
Or a sense of peace when you're making a decision.
Like
Or even sometimes like a sense of warning when you're about to make a bad decision.
it's almost like that feeling of like you just know what the right thing is to do.
Absolutely.
And you can't explain it. You just know.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what we're talking about here with this excerpt?
Yeah, I think so. The excerpt goes on to talk about some of the practices for cultivating this.
Okay.
And one of the things that it emphasizes is the importance of stillness and silence.
Okay.
Which is really, I think, something that's missing in our culture today.
Well, yeah, we're just constantly bombarded with noise and information and,
Exactly. So
authority.
creating space to quiet your mind
Right.
can actually help you become more receptive.
More mindful.
Yes.
Yeah.
To that inner voice.
Okay. So stillness, silence, mindfulness. Are we saying like those are the keys to being able to hear God's voice?
I think they're essential.
Okay.
But, I think it's also important to remember that everybody's experience is different.
Okay.
I've talked to people who've had what they would describe as very dramatic experiences.
Oh, really?
Where they've actually heard like a voice.
Wow.
But I've also talked to people who've just had a very gentle nudge.
Yeah.
Or a sense of knowing.
Right.
So I think it's important to remember that there's no one size fits all.
Yeah. That makes sense. It's kind of like saying, how does it feel to be in love?
Right.
Like everybody's going to describe that differently.
Yeah. It's exactly.
But it's still real for them, however they're experiencing it.
Absolutely.
So I guess, for someone listening to this who's thinking, man, I would love to experience that. I would love to be more in tune with, God's voice.
Yeah.
Where would you tell them to start?
I would say start with stillness.
Okay.
Even 5 minutes a day
Okay.
of just intentional quiet
Right.
can make a big difference.
Yeah.
And just pay attention to what comes up for you
Yeah.
in those moments.
Just notice.
Yes.
Okay.
And you might be surprised at what you start to hear.
Wow. This has been really interesting.
Right.
It makes me think about, even just the idea that there might be a whole conversation happening on the inside
Yeah.
that we're not even aware of.
Absolutely.
Just because we're not taking the time to listen.
Right.
Wow. What a thought.
It is.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for everyone listening. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.